The portrait exists in a very specific form. The photographs, and there are hundreds of them accumulated across more than 6 decades of public life, show a woman whose posture was so architecturally correct it appeared engineered rather than assumed, who wore the same upswept silver hair, and the same graduated ropes of pearls, and the same expression of composed institutional authority that required nothing from the people looking at it and conceded nothing to their expectations of warmth or approachability or any of the ordinary human signals that people transmit when they wish to be understood as people rather than as the positions they occupy. The image became, across the decades of its accumulation in the public record, the defining visual statement of a specific kind of British queenship, organized entirely around the institution's requirements, rather than around any dimension of the person performing the role that could be mistaken for personal expression. She had refined herself across the middle decades of the 20th century into the most recognizable royal image in Britain, after the crown itself. Wearing the same silhouette of toque hat and long pre-war skirt and extraordinary vertical carriage that the relevant photographs document with the consistency of a woman who had found the version of herself the role required, and had maintained it with a discipline that looked effortless because it had been exercised for so long that effortlessness was precisely what the relevant exercise had produced. The image was everywhere. It attended royal weddings and coronations and state occasions and hospital openings and the kinds of public ceremonies that the British monarchy accumulates across decades of institutional continuity. And it was always the same image, composed and unreachable, producing in the people who encountered it in person a specific physical response that the relevant accounts describe, with a consistency across independent sources that makes the response something closer to corroborated evidence than to individual impression. The response was fear. Not the theoretical fear of institutional hierarchy, the ordinary deference that subjects render to sovereigns in the formal conditions of public ceremony. Not the performed awe of people who have rehearsed the relevant conventions and deploy them in the relevant contexts. The fear documented in the accounts of the people who were inside the relevant world with her was the fear of the specific person, the fear that courtiers experienced when they heard her distinctive measured tread in the palace corridor and straightened involuntarily before she appeared around the corner. The fear that antique dealers in London and the country felt when her car drew up outside their premises, and they rearranged quickly which pieces occupied the most visible positions and which did not. The fear that her own children described across memoirs and letters, and in the accounts of people who were closest to them across the decades of the relevant adult lives, in terms whose consistency across the independent sources tells the honest examiner everything that needs to be known about the specific quality of the domestic environment those children were formed inside. She was also, in the specific terms the documented private record assembled from the relevant biographies and archives most directly supports, one of the most consequential individual figures in the 20th century management of the British monarchy's institutional survival. The fear and the achievement coexisted across the full span of the adult life. They were both products of the same formation. Understanding what the formation was and what it made is the necessary precondition for the honest account of the person it produced. There is a second version of Queen Mary available in the public record. Not the version of the photographs, though the photographs are where the honest examination of the second version most productively begins, because the photographs document the performance with such accumulated authority that the gap between the performance and the private reality becomes most visible precisely in the performance's completeness. The second version is in the biographies that drew on the accounts of the people who were inside the relevant world across the full span of the relevant adult life. It is in the archives, in the portions of the correspondence and the diaries that archival access has made available for examination. It is in the memoirs of the relevant children and in the accounts of the relevant courtiers and the household staff and the antique dealers and the hosts who received the visits and who described with the consistency of people recounting a specific shared experience the quality of what the relevant presence produced in the conditions of the relevant encounter. The second version and the official version are both in the permanent record. Both are supported by the evidence that produced them. This account examines the second version alongside the first, because the second version is the version the institutional management of the relevant public legacy was organized across the relevant decades to prevent from becoming the dominant public understanding of who Queen Mary actually was, when the performance was not the immediate organizing requirement of the relevant occasion. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The official account is the account the institutional management of her public legacy consolidated across the decades following her death in March 1953. It is the account of the formidable matriarchal stabilizer, the woman who held the British monarchy together across 3 reigns and 2 world wars, and the abdication crisis of 1936, who defined what modern queenship looked like from the inside out, who maintained the institutional dignity of the crown through the most demanding sequence of events the relevant institution had been required to navigate since the 17th century's constitutional convulsions. The account is accurate in what it asserts. The institutional achievement was real. Its significance in the specific conditions of the relevant historical period was genuine and considerable. She did hold it together. She did define the role. The relevant institution survived the relevant period's most significant challenges, partly because of what the relevant person's sustained management of the relevant institutional requirements produced across the full span of the relevant decades. What the official account does not examine is the specific human cost of the achievement, and the specific human character that produced the achievement alongside the cost. The character that produced the achievement was not a different and kinder version of the woman who produced the fear in the corridor. They were the same woman. The achievement and the fear and the specific costs paid by the people closest to her across the full span of the relevant adult life were all products of the same formation, applied to the same circumstances, organized around the same primary principle, across the full span of the relevant decades. This account examines the formation and what it made. The family into which Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes of Teck was born on the 26th of May 1867 at Kensington Palace in London, occupied a position in the hierarchy of European royalty that was precise enough to be visible and insufficient enough to be a permanent source of private anxiety for everyone required to manage its implications across the relevant social world. The House of Teck was a morganatic German royal house, which in the specific conventions of the 19th century European dynastic world meant it carried the name and the ceremonial attributes of royalty while being excluded from the full dynastic claims that the major reigning houses organized their marriage arrangements around. The morganatic designation was not disgrace. The Tecks were received at the relevant courts. They were invited to the relevant occasions. They inhabited the social world of European royalty and were acknowledged within it, with the specific acknowledgement that the relevant world applied to people in the relevant social position, which was the acknowledgement of reception rather than the acknowledgement of belonging, and the distinction between the two kinds of acknowledgement was one that the people on the receiving end of the relevant reception, rather than belonging, understood with the acuteness of people for whom the distinction was not an abstraction, but the organizing condition of their social experience. The child who was called May by her family grew up inside this condition, and the formation it produced in her was the formation of someone who understood from early enough in her development that the management of the performance of appropriate royalty was not optional in the conditions of the Teck family's social position. It was the primary available mechanism for maintaining the standing that the morganatic insufficiency was always potentially threatening to undermine. The performance required specific things: the correct posture, the correct management of the relevant social occasions in the relevant register of the relevant institutional vocabulary, the sustained maintenance of the appearance of institutional adequacy in conditions where the relevant institutional adequacy was the primary available asset, and where the alternative to its maintenance was the specific social consequence that the relevant world imposed on the families whose management of the available performance failed in the conditions of the relevant social observation. May studied the requirements. She absorbed the codes with the accuracy of someone for whom the codes were not the background of the social occasions she was being taken to, but the primary material of a sustained and serious study organized around the practical necessity of performing them correctly, in conditions where the performance's correctness was what the relevant assessment was most organized around evaluating. Her father was Francis, Duke of Teck, a man whose personal qualities the available accounts describe as genuine, warm, and in effect incapable of managing the financial dimensions of the life his position placed him inside. He was charming and sociable, and possessed of the specific personal ease in the relevant social contexts that the relevant world valued in the people who possessed it naturally, rather than through the performance of its cultivation. He moved through the relevant social world with the ease of someone who genuinely enjoyed the relevant social occasions and who was genuinely good at the relevant social engagements that the relevant occasions organized around. He was also, and this is the practical fact about him that mattered most for the formation of his eldest daughter, entirely unable to manage the finances of a family living in the specific social world that his position required them to inhabit. The inability was not a moral failing in the simple sense of deliberate irresponsibility. It was the specific practical incapacity of someone whose formation had not included the relevant financial management capability, and who found himself inside a domestic economy whose requirements consistently exceeded what the relevant available resources could meet without the sustained intervention of the relevant external assistance. The assistance was sometimes available. The need for it was consistent. The debt accumulated across the decades of May's childhood. The relevant correspondence of the relevant period documents the accumulation's specific character with the specificity of primary source material produced by people who were inside the relevant management of the relevant consequences. The family received various forms of assistance from the relevant members of the wider royal family at various points across the relevant decades. The assistance managed the most acute consequences of the relevant accumulation without resolving the underlying condition that produced it. The underlying condition was the condition of a family living above its means, in conditions where the means were already insufficient for the relevant life's requirements, and its management required across the relevant decades the specific combination of the relevant external assistance and the relevant social management of the relevant consequences that the relevant world applied to the relevant category of financially embarrassed royalty. Her mother was Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, known in the relevant world as Fat Mary, with the specific social unkindness that relevant social circles have always deployed against members who deviate from the physical requirements the relevant conventions organized around women of the relevant position. Princess Mary Adelaide was large and warm and enormously popular in the specific public contexts where genuine warmth and genuine personal energy translated into the kind of public affection that royal figures accumulate when the relevant public engagement is organized around something genuinely felt rather than its performance. She was also, like her husband, entirely without the financial management capability the relevant domestic economy required, and the combination of two people without the relevant capability applied to a domestic economy whose requirements consistently exceeded the available resources produced across the relevant decades, the pattern of the relevant financial difficulties that the relevant record most directly documents. The practical consequence of the financial situation that mattered most for the formation of the child who would eventually become Queen Mary was the exile. In 1883, when May was 16 years old, the family's debt had accumulated to the specific point where the relevant social world's tolerance for the accumulation's visibility had reached its limit, and the family was required to leave England and establish themselves abroad while the relevant financial arrangements were negotiated into a condition that might permit the return. They went to Florence. They settled in a villa outside the city. They remained in Italy for 2 years, in the conditions of the relevant financial embarrassments management, and in the specific social world of the relevant expatriate community that Florence in the early 1880s organized around itself. The Florence years produced something in May that the subsequent 6 decades of her adult life would deploy with an obsessiveness and a specific social ruthlessness that the formation those 2 years produced in her made possible in ways no other period of her development quite replicated. She looked. In Florence she looked at everything, with the quality of attention that the available accounts of her in the relevant period describe as the attention of someone for whom the decorative objects of the relevant world were not the cultural background of the occasions she was being taken to, but the primary material of a sustained and serious engagement organized around the genuine interest of someone who was finding in the relevant objects the kind of engagement the relevant social world was not organized around providing. She was 16 and then 17 and then 18, at the ages when the things a person looks at carefully enough become part of the permanent architecture of the interior life, and she looked carefully enough at a sufficient quantity of the finest available objects in Florence's museums and private collections and the relevant houses of the relevant social world she was moving through, to build across those 2 years the specific eye whose subsequent deployment would produce such sustained and specific effects across the decades of her adult life. The knowledge was genuine. This matters to establish plainly, because the subsequent honest account of what the knowledge was deployed in service of across those decades could be misread as a dismissal of the underlying capability, and the underlying capability was real. She became, across the Florence years and the subsequent decades of sustained serious engagement with the relevant material, one of the genuinely knowledgeable people of her era in the decorative arts of the relevant periods. The Sèvres porcelain and the English silver and the Fabergé objects and the Meissen and the relevant miniatures and the relevant furniture and the relevant clocks and the full range of the relevant categories of the relevant decorative arts were objects she could assess with the accuracy of someone whose decades of sustained looking had built the genuine capability in the conditions of its consistent exercise. The relevant experts who worked alongside her across the full span of her adult life consistently acknowledged the relevant capability in the accounts the relevant biographies have preserved. The knowledge was built in Florence, in the conditions of the relevant sustained looking and the relevant genuine engagement, and it was the knowledge of someone who had engaged with the relevant material with genuine seriousness rather than with the performance of appropriate cultural appreciation. What Florence also did, alongside the building of the relevant eye and the relevant knowledge, was expose May to the specific quality of life that people of limited means but genuine cultural engagement can build in the conditions of a city organized around the production and the preservation of the relevant cultural objects. And the specific quality of that exposure left in the relevant formation, the specific mark of someone who had found in the relevant cultural engagement, something that the relevant social world of the Tech family's English position had not been organized around providing. The mark was permanent. It was one of the genuine things about Queen Mary, in a life whose genuine dimensions were sometimes difficult to locate within the sustained management of the relevant performance's requirements. The family returned to England in 1885. May was 18. She returned with the specific combination of the English royal formation and the Florentine cultural engagement that placed her in a distinct and specific position in the relevant marriage market. She had adequate royal blood, although the morganatic insufficiency was present, as the background condition of the relevant assessment. She had genuine personal accomplishment in the specific form of the relevant knowledge and the relevant composure and the specific social intelligence of someone who had spent her most formative years managing the performance of appropriate royalty in the conditions of insufficient means. She was composed. She was capable. She was presented at the relevant court and observed by the relevant observers and assessed by the relevant assessors. And the assessment produced the specific conclusions about the relevant candidate's specific qualities, that the relevant world organized its evaluation of significant female candidates around. She was 24 years old in the autumn of 1891, and the relevant institutional purpose for which she would eventually be identified as the most suitable available candidate had become pressing in ways whose specific nature the honest account requires to examine with the directness that the relevant official biographies of the relevant period consistently declined to provide. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, who would become King Edward VII. He was 28 years old when his engagement to May of Teck was announced in December 1891. He was second in line to the British throne. He was also, in the specific terms that the honest examination of the available documentation most directly establishes, a man whose fitness for the role his birth had assigned him was not established by any of the available evidence that the relevant historical examination has assembled in the decades since the relevant events. He was slow. The slowness was the specific intellectual slowness, documented in the consistent accounts of the relevant tutors and the relevant naval officers, and the relevant companions who had been assigned across the relevant years of his formation, and who had found in him someone whose engagement with the relevant material was insufficient for the relevant demands of the relevant position, in ways that the relevant professional efforts had not succeeded in addressing. He was also, by the documentary record the relevant historical scholarship has assembled across the decades since the relevant events, someone whose private life was organized around personal engagements, whose specific character created specific difficulties for the relevant institutional management of the public account of a future king. The specific nature of those engagements has been documented in the relevant historical scholarship and biographies, including the work of Michael Harrison and Frank Harris, and the present account notes them in the terms of the institutional fact they represented. The fact of an heir whose private conduct was the subject of the relevant institutional management's most sustained and most practiced damage limitation activities in the conditions of the relevant public accounts requirements. The engagement to May of Tech was the institutional solution to multiple simultaneous institutional problems, applied with the efficiency that the relevant management brought to the management of the relevant category of institutional challenge. May was suitable, she was available. She had demonstrated in the specific conditions of her formation the specific capability of managing the relevant performance with the relevant consistency. The engagement was organized through the mechanisms of the relevant world's management of significant royal marriages in conditions where the institutional calculations requirements were the primary organizing principle of the arrangement. The engagement was announced in December 1891. It lasted 6 weeks. Prince Albert Victor died on the 14th of January 1892 from influenza that progressed to pneumonia in the conditions of an outbreak affecting multiple members of the relevant household during the relevant epidemic. He was 28 years old. The death was announced to a public whose awareness of the engagement was the awareness of 6 weeks of the relevant engagement's coverage, and the public response to the announcement was the response of people who had received the romantic narrative of the engagement in the specific register of the romantic narrative, and who received the death in the specific register of the romantic narrative's most acute available conclusion. May had known Prince Albert Victor for a limited time, and in the conditions of the relevant institutional arrangement, rather than the conditions of sustained, genuine personal acquaintance. The grief that the relevant accounts document in the period following the death was real in both of the available dimensions, the personal and the institutional, and the honest account does not require choosing between them. She had genuinely invested in the relevant prospect even when the investment was organized primarily around the prospect's institutional significance, rather than around the specific personal qualities of the individual whose death concluded the prospect. 6 weeks of engagement and the subsequent grief were the grief of someone whose available social world had organized itself around the relevant prospect, and whose available future had been reorganized around the prospect's specific requirements. And the loss of the prospect was the loss of both the relevant person and the relevant future's available shape. The 17 months between the death in January 1892 and the engagement to Prince George in May 1893 were managed by the relevant institutional world in the specific direction of maintaining May's availability for the relevant institutional purpose in the conditions that the relevant period required for the relevant management to operate. What this meant in the specific social conditions of the relevant world was the management of the relevant social engagements and the relevant family communications in the direction of producing the conditions in which Prince George's attention could be directed toward May, and in which the relevant conditions for the relevant courtship could develop in the direction the relevant institutional calculation required. Prince George, Duke of York, was the second son. He had been trained for the Navy because the relevant order of succession had originally placed the throne at a comfortable generation's distance from his immediate requirements, and the naval training had produced in him the specific combination of professional competence and personal directness that the Navy of the relevant era was organized around producing in the men who committed their adult formation to it. He was capable and organized and genuinely committed to the relevant professional requirements of the relevant position he eventually assumed. He was also, in the specific domestic sense that the honest account of the subsequent marriage most directly requires to establish, capable of a sustained temper, whose expression in the conditions of the domestic life was the expression of someone for whom the direct communication of displeasure was the natural and primary available mode of engagement with circumstances that had failed to meet the relevant standards. The relevant directness had been appropriate in the naval service. Its application to the household and to the children in the conditions of the relevant domestic life was the application of a professional learned behavior to a context that required something different from the professional learned behavior for the relevant outcomes the relevant context was organized around producing. They were engaged in May 1893 and married on the 6th of July 1893 at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. She was 26. He was 27. The wedding produced the specific public account of an appropriate royal marriage that the relevant institutional requirements organized the relevant coverage around, and it produced across the subsequent 42 years the specific domestic environment whose private account, assembled from the relevant biographies and the relevant correspondence and the accounts of the people inside the relevant household across the relevant decades, is the honest account of what the relevant marriage actually contained in the conditions of its daily operation. The marriage was not a cruel arrangement in the simple sense. The honest account does not support the reading of a man who treated his wife with deliberate unkindness, nor the reading of a woman who was comprehensively miserable in ways that overwhelmed the available satisfactions of the relevant life. What the honest account does support is the reading of two people whose formation had developed them in substantially different emotional directions, placed in the conditions of an institutional marriage, whose requirements organized both of their lives around the relevant public performance of appropriate royal partnership, in conditions where the private dimensions of the relationship were managed within the relevant institutional framework rather than in the terms of genuine mutual exploration and genuine mutual provision. The household staff described a man who shouted when things fell below his standards, which they did with the frequency that things fall below the standards of someone who maintains high standards in the conditions of a large domestic establishment, with a full staff and multiple public and private obligations managed simultaneously. The children described a father whose presence in the domestic world was the presence of someone whose assessment of the relevant shortcomings in the relevant available circumstances was communicated with the directness that his professional formation had always organized the relevant communications around. May manage the relevant communications in the conditions that the relevant management's available modes produced in someone whose formation had always organized itself around the management of the available circumstances in the direction of the available stability. The management was sustained. The cost of the management across 42 years accumulated in ways that the honest account of who Queen Mary was requires to examine in the context of what the sustained management of the relevant domestic expression at the relevant personal cost produced in the relevant person across the relevant decades. The children came across 11 years, from June 1894 to July 1905. 6 children in 11 years. Which is a biological fact about those years that carries practical and emotional implications for the daily domestic life that the relevant accounts of the relevant period acknowledge in the terms the relevant era applied to the relevant physical requirements of the relevant domestic role. What the honest account requires to examine is not simply the fact of the relevant production, but the specific quality of the environment the production placed the relevant children inside, because the environment is the primary available mechanism of the relevant formation, and the relevant formation is what the subsequent decades of the relevant biographies document across the accounts of the relevant children's adult lives. The accounts are consistent across the independent sources. The consistency is what gives them the weight of corroborated observation rather than individual interpretation. What the accounts describe across the independent sources, assembled by the relevant biographers from the relevant testimony of the people who were inside the relevant household across the relevant childhood years, and from the relevant private correspondence, and from the memoirs of the relevant children themselves, is a domestic environment whose primary organizational principle was the management of the relevant performance of appropriate royalty at the specific expense of the provision of the ordinary human warmth that children require from the adults responsible for their care. The performance was impeccable. The warmth was insufficient. Edward, who was called David by the family, and who would eventually be King Edward the Faithing, for 326 days before the abdication, described his parents in his memoir, A King's Story, published in 1951, with the specific restrained vocabulary of someone who has processed the relevant experience across the decades of the subsequent adult life, and who is communicating the relevant assessment in terms organized around the persistent management of the relevant institutional relationships, even as he attempts to provide an honest account of what the relevant childhood formation was actually like to grow up inside. The relevant vocabulary is restrained. The relevant assessment beneath the vocabulary is consistent with the assessments available in the other independent accounts, the relevant biographies assembled from the relevant period. He describes parents who were formally correct in the management of the relevant parental requirements, and who were emotionally unavailable in the specific sense of being organized around the performance of the relevant institutional positions, rather than around the provision of the genuine human engagement that the relevant children's formation required from the adults responsible for their care. The relevant children address their parents as Sir and Ma'am. This is documented in multiple independent accounts of the relevant household's conventions, and is one of the most specific available pieces of evidence for the specific quality of the relevant domestic environment's organization around the relevant institutional register, rather than the ordinary domestic register of parents and children in the relevant era's available domestic conventions. The relevant convention was the convention of the relevant court, rather than the convention of the relevant family, applied to the relevant domestic occasions of the relevant household, with the consistency that the relevant primary organizational principles operation in the relevant domestic conditions produced. Albert, who became King George VI, had the stammer. The stammer was real and severe, and it shaped the full span of the subsequent adult life in ways that the relevant biographical accounts and the subsequent cinematic rendering of the relevant story have made the most widely known available dimension of the relevant person's adult public life. The specific connection between the severity of early anxiety and the development of the relevant speech difficulties is a connection that the relevant developmental understanding of the period and the subsequent decades has documented sufficiently to make its acknowledgement in the relevant context appropriate. What can be stated with the confidence the available evidence in the specific case directly supports is that the stammer was present and severe, and that the specific conditions of the relevant domestic environment contained the relevant factors whose presence in the conditions of the relevant formation, the relevant developmental understanding, associates with the relevant outcomes. Albert's stammer was managed across years of sustained professional engagement with Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist whose work with the relevant royal patient became one of the more extensively documented therapeutic relationships of the relevant era. Logue worked with Albert across the years between 1926 and the relevant wartime period, with the sustained professional commitment whose specific outcomes the relevant accounts document as genuine and significant. The stammer was managed. The anxiety that the relevant formation had produced was managed within the conditions of the relevant marriage to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, whose specific qualities the relevant accounts describe as the most directly sustaining available relationship of the relevant adult life. The relevant adult life was managed in the conditions of the relevant formation's legacy, alongside the relevant available management resources. The relevant formation's legacy was present throughout. The third child was Mary, the Princess Royal, born in 1897. She lived most of her adult life in circumstances that the relevant accounts describe, with the consistency of people noting the specific combination of personal dignity and private difficulty that the relevant domestic environment's formation had produced in someone of her specific combination of available qualities, in the conditions of the relevant adult life that the relevant formation had organized her around inhabiting. Henry, born in 1900, became the Duke of Gloucester. George, born in 1902, became the Duke of Kent, and was the most personally charming of the relevant children by the consistent assessment of the people who encountered him in the relevant social world across the relevant adult years. His personal warmth and his social ease were the qualities that the relevant accounts of the people who knew him most consistently identify as the most immediately available dimensions of his specific public persona. And the relationship between those qualities and the relevant domestic environment's specific formation is a relationship the relevant accounts address with the consistency of people observing a person who had found in the relevant adult social world the specific outlet for the relevant personal warmth that the relevant domestic environment had not been organized around providing in the relevant childhood conditions. May acknowledge the relevant insufficiency. She acknowledged it in the private channels of the relevant correspondence, in terms that are among the most direct available primary sources for the gap between the relevant performance and the relevant reality. She wrote to one of her sons, in a letter that exists in the relevant archives and has been cited in the relevant biographies, acknowledging that she found it difficult to express feeling face-to-face in the conditions of the relevant direct relationship, and preferred to communicate it in writing, where the specific conditions of the written form provided the relevant available distance that the relevant formation's operation in the relevant direct relationship did not. The letter is the most direct available primary source for the relevant self-awareness about the relevant gap. It tells the honest examiner that the relevant person was aware of the gap and found in the conditions of the relevant formation no available mechanism for addressing the gap in the conditions of the relevant direct relationships with the people who most required the gap to be addressed. The awareness without the mechanism is the most honest available description of the relevant domestic environment's most significant characteristic, and it is the characteristic whose effects on the relevant children the relevant biographies document with the consistency of corroborated observation across the relevant decades of the relevant adult lives. Prince John occupies a specific and significant place in the honest account of Queen Mary's management of the domestic environment and deserves the specific and careful examination that his case most directly warrants. He was born in July 1905, the sixth and youngest child. The epilepsy became apparent across the early years of his life. His specific condition was progressive and difficult to manage in the conditions of the relevant era's available medical understanding and treatment. The learning difficulties that accompanied the epilepsy in the specific combination that John's case presented made his management in the conditions of the primary family household increasingly difficult across the relevant early years of the relevant management's requirements. The combination presented the relevant institutional management with the specific challenge of a family member whose condition was inconsistent with the public account the relevant institution required to maintain in the conditions of the relevant institutional position's management of the relevant public presentation. The management decision was the decision of the relevant institutional world applied to the relevant challenge, with the efficiency that the relevant management brought to the relevant category of institutional problem. John was placed at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk under the care of his nurse Charlotte Bill, who was known to the family as Lala. The placement was organized in the conditions of the relevant institutional management of the relevant challenge's specific implications for the relevant public account, and it produced the specific outcome of John's effective institutional invisibility from the relevant public presentation of the relevant family's domestic life across the remaining years of the relevant life. Lala was the consistent, warm daily presence in John's life across the years of the relevant residence at Wood Farm, and the accounts of the people who observed the relationship between them describe in Lala the specific quality of the genuine devoted attentiveness that the relevant child required and found in her in the conditions of the relevant placement's specific organization of the relevant caring arrangement. She was there daily. She knew him. She provided in the conditions of the relevant arrangement the specific provision of the genuine human warmth and the genuine daily attendance that the relevant placement had made the primary available source of the relevant provision for the relevant child. The visits from Queen Mary and from King George V to Wood Farm were infrequent. The documentation of the relevant visit frequency in the relevant biographies that have examined the relevant period most carefully supports the conclusion that the visits were not organized around the maximization of the relevant contact between John and the family, from which the relevant management decision had separated him, but around the management of the relevant institutional requirements in the conditions of the relevant management's other organizational priorities. He was in effect unknown to the general public. His existence was not prominently acknowledged in the relevant public communications about the relevant royal family's domestic composition. He was absent from the official family photographs of the relevant period. The relevant institutional management of his existence was the management of the relevant invisibility from the relevant public account. John died on the 18th of January 1919. He was 13 years old. He had a severe seizure at Wood Farm in his sleep and had not recovered. Queen Mary's diary entry for the day has been examined by the relevant biographers with the attention of people who are looking for evidence of the relevant emotional response in the conditions of the relevant formation's primary mode of engagement with the significant personal experiences of the relevant life. What they most consistently identify in the relevant entry is the quality of contained restraint that the honest account identifies as the most consistent available expression of the relevant formation's operation in the conditions of the significant personal experiences of the relevant life across the full span of the relevant adult decades. Queen Mary wrote in her diary that it was a great relief when the relevant child was finally taken, because the relevant suffering had been the relevant suffering, and the relevant end had been the relevant end. The relevant biographers who have examined the relevant entry have examined it with the care of people examining primary source material, whose specific content places the relevant author in the specific position of someone who has expressed in the private channel of the relevant diary entry the relevant response to the relevant event, in the relevant terms of the relevant formation's most available mode, of the relevant engagement with the relevant significant personal experience. The genuine feeling for John was real. The relevant portions of the relevant correspondence that the relevant biographies have cited document the relevant feeling with the specificity of someone who experienced it genuinely. The management of the relevant feeling through the relevant formation's primary available mode across the full span of the relevant significant personal experience's duration was also real. Both things were simultaneously present in the relevant diary entry and in the woman the entry documented on that day. The relationship between Queen Mary and her sons was a relationship that the relevant available biographies document across the relevant adult years in the terms of the relevant accounts of the people who were proximate to the relevant relationships and who observed them from inside the relevant available positions. The relationships were not entirely without warmth. The relevant biographies do not support the reading of a mother who was entirely without genuine feeling for the relevant children, or who was organized around the deliberate deprivation of the relevant children from the relevant available warmth. What the relevant biographies do support is the reading of someone whose formation had produced in the relevant person the specific organizational principle of the relevant performance's priority over the relevant genuine expression, and whose application of the relevant organizational principle in the conditions of the relevant parental relationships produced in those relationships the specific quality of the relevant emotional insufficiency, whose effects the relevant adult lives most directly documented. David, who would abdicate, found in the relevant public engagements the specific outlet for the relevant personal warmth that the relevant domestic environment had not been organized around providing in the relevant childhood conditions. He was, by the consistent assessment of the people who encountered him in the relevant public occasions across the relevant Prince of Wales years, a man whose specific quality of genuine personal engagement with the relevant available people in the relevant available public contexts produced a form of public affection whose quality distinguished it from the performed warmth of someone going through the relevant public motions. He meant it. The relevant crowds meant their response. the relevant public engagement, was organized around a genuine connection whose specific quality the relevant accounts of people present at the relevant occasions describe with the consistency of people who found in the relevant experience something different from the routine public engagement of the relevant institutional position. Albert, the second son and the man who would eventually manage the relevant constitutional position through the most demanding available wartime conditions, managed the relevant domestic formation's legacy with the help of the relevant marriage to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, whose specific qualities the relevant accounts describe, in terms whose consistency across independent sources tells the honest examiner something specific about what the relevant marriage provided in the conditions of the relevant formation's legacy. She was warm where the relevant formation had been cold. She was emotionally present where the relevant formation had been emotionally managed. She provided in the conditions of the relevant adult relationship the specific provision of the genuine human warmth that the relevant childhood formation had not provided in adequate measure, and the relevant provision made possible in the conditions of the relevant adult life, the management of the relevant constitutional position, with the genuine dignity and the genuine seriousness that the relevant reign's available accounts most consistently identify as its most significant available characteristic. The relationship between Queen Mary and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon across the decades of the relevant parallel lives was a relationship whose honest account requires acknowledging both the genuine respect and the specific complexity that the relevant available biographies document across the relevant available evidence. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon provided the genuine warmth to Queen Mary's son that Queen Mary had not provided in the relevant childhood conditions. The provision was visible to Queen Mary from the conditions of the relevant proximity to the relevant marriage across the relevant years of the relevant parallel lives. The relationship between the two women was organized around the relevant institutional relationships and the relevant personal connections in conditions where both dimensions were present, and where the honest account of the relationship requires holding both rather than organizing itself around either in isolation from the other. The relationship between Queen Mary and her daughter, Princess Mary the Princess Royal, was a relationship that the relevant biographies examine with the care of people examining a relationship whose specific quality was organized around the relevant domestic formation's most consistent available expression in the conditions of the relevant daughter's specific combination of the relevant available qualities and the relevant available adult life. Princess Mary married Viscount Lascelles in 1922 and lived most of her adult life in the conditions of the relevant Yorkshire estate and the relevant institutional engagement with the relevant available public duties, whose management the relevant formation had produced in her as the most available mode of the relevant adult life's organization. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I love hearing from you. The collecting was the most peculiar and in certain respects the most revealing dimension of Queen Mary's adult character, because the specific mechanism of the collecting's operation in the conditions of the relevant social world tells the honest examiner something about the relevant character that no other available dimension of the relevant adult behavior tells with the same clarity. It tells the honest examiner what the specific combination of the genuine knowledge and the institutional authority of the Queen of England produced when deployed in the specific direction of the relevant preferences provision through the specific social mechanisms the relevant position made available for the deployment. She had the eye. The eye was real, and its genesis has been established in the preceding account of the Florence years. What the Florence years built in the relevant person was a specific capability of assessing decorative objects in the relevant fields, with an accuracy that distinguished the genuine connoisseur from the person performing the role of the relevant connoisseur in the conditions of the relevant social world's available performance. She could look at a piece of Sèvres porcelain and tell you its date of manufacture, the specific factory's production run it was part of, its condition assessment, and its relationship to the relevant other examples of the relevant production that the relevant collection had assembled. She could do the same with the relevant English silver, and the relevant miniatures, and the relevant furniture, and the full range of the relevant categories of the relevant decorative arts, that the relevant decades of the relevant sustained engagement had built the relevant capability in the conditions of the relevant exercise across. The relevant experts acknowledged it. The knowledge was real. The knowledge was also, in the specific conditions of the social world Queen Mary conducted her collecting within, an instrument whose combination with the institutional authority of the Queen of England produced a specific mechanism, whose operation in the relevant conditions was more efficient than any simple combination of knowledge and authority separately would have produced. The mechanism was the admiration. She would visit. She visited private houses and country houses, and the households of the relevant courtiers and the relevant friends, and the premises of the relevant antique dealers, with the frequency that the relevant accounts of the period document as the frequency of someone whose engagement with the available objects of the relevant world was organized as a sustained and systematic activity, rather than as the occasional leisure of someone with incidental interest. She would arrive, accompanied by the relevant household members, and she would move through the relevant available spaces with the eye that the relevant decades had developed, and she would look at the relevant objects, and when she found the relevant object, that the relevant eye identified as the relevant thing, she would admire it. The admiration was the mechanism. The specific documented accounts of Queen Mary's collecting in action provide some of the more illuminating available evidence for the honest account of the relevant character dimension. Lady Airlie, who was Queen Mary's closest friend across the relevant decades and whose memoir Thatched with Gold, published in 1962, provides one of the most intimate available accounts of the relevant person across the relevant adult years, describes the specific quality of the relevant collectings operation in the conditions of the relevant friendship, with the candor of someone writing at a sufficient distance from the relevant events to provide the relevant honest account, without the relevant institutional costs that the relevant candor would have imposed in the conditions of the relevant events' immediate circumstances. The relevant accounts are specific. They describe the relevant visits and the relevant admiration and the relevant outcomes, with the specificity of someone who had observed the relevant mechanism's operation from inside the relevant social world, across the relevant decades of the relevant friendship. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The relevant accounts across the relevant available biographies describe the specific combination of the relevant genuine knowledge and the relevant social mechanism whose deployment in the relevant conditions produced the relevant outcomes. The genuine knowledge made the relevant admiration's expression specific in a way that the relevant performance of appreciation, without the genuine knowledge, could not have produced, because the genuine knowledge organized the relevant admiration around the specific available qualities of the relevant available object, in terms that told the relevant owner something real about what the relevant admiration was organized around, rather than the general appreciation of the relevant valuable thing. The genuine specificity of the relevant knowledge's deployment in the relevant admiration made the relevant social mechanism's operation more efficient in the relevant conditions because it established the relevant authority of the relevant admiration in terms whose genuine quality the relevant owner recognized as different from the performed appreciation of someone going through the relevant available motions. The relevant person's awareness of the relevant mechanism's operation was the awareness of someone whose formation had always organized the management of the relevant performance as the primary available mode of engagement with the relevant available circumstances, and whose deployment of the relevant mechanism in the relevant available conditions was the deployment of someone whose formation had produced the relevant available capability in the conditions of the relevant practice across the relevant decades of the relevant exercise. The relevant biographies, and particularly the work of Hugo Vickers, whose sustained engagement with the relevant period and its relevant figures provide some of the more specific accounts of the relevant mechanism's operation in the relevant conditions, describe the specific quality of Queen Mary's expressed admiration with the precision of someone who had assembled the relevant accounts from multiple independent sources and who understood the pattern those accounts documented across the relevant decades of the relevant mechanism's consistent operation. The admiration was informed, it was specific. It was organized around the genuine capability of someone who understood what she was looking at, and whose expressed appreciation of the relevant object's specific qualities carried the authority of that genuine understanding. It was also a request. The social conventions of the relevant world in the specific conditions of the relevant institutional authority's operation made it a request. In the ordinary social world, admiring something someone owns is a social performance of appreciation that the owner receives and moves on from. In the specific social world of someone whose institutional position places her at the apex of the relevant hierarchy, and whose engagement with the relevant social world is organized around the management of the relevant relationships between the relevant institutional authority and the people whose lives are conducted within its orbit, the expression of admiring interest in a specific object generates in the object's owner a social calculation that the relevant conditions make in effect inescapable. The calculation is the calculation of what the social and institutional consequences of declining to provide the admired object to the relevant admiring royal will cost in the conditions of the relevant relationship, weighed against the cost of the provision. The calculation, conducted by people who understood the relevant social world's management of the relevant relationships with the relevant institutional authority, consistently produced the conclusion that the provision of the admired object was the available option whose costs were substantially lower than the costs of the available alternatives. The provision was made. Again and again, and across the full span of the relevant decades of the relevant reign, the provision was made. Objects moved from the collections and the households and the premises of the people Queen Mary visited into the royal collections through the specific mechanism of the admiration and the social calculation the admiration's expression made effectively inevitable in the conditions of the relevant institutional authority's operation in the relevant direction. The movement was documented in the relevant biographies and in the accounts of the relevant people who received the relevant visits, and described with the consistency of people recounting a shared experience, the specific quality of the situation the admiration placed them inside. Antique dealers in London developed specific management strategies for the visits. The most consistently documented was the strategy of arrangement before the relevant arrival, which was the strategy of placing the objects the relevant dealer was most willing to part with in the most visible and most accessible positions in the relevant premises, and of removing from the relevant sightlines or placing in the relevant less accessible storage the objects whose loss would be most costly to the relevant commercial operation. The strategy was practical, and it is documented in the accounts of the relevant dealers and the relevant people who worked in the relevant field during the relevant period, with the candor of people describing a standard professional practice that the relevant repeated occasions had made standard through the accumulated experience of the relevant visits. The dealers knew what was coming. They arranged accordingly. The visits proceeded. The relevant transfers were produced in the conditions of the relevant mechanism's consistent operation. Private households were less well positioned to deploy the relevant counter-arrangement strategy. The relevant social conventions of appropriate royal hospitality did not accommodate the specific prior rearrangement of the relevant collection that the relevant commercial premises could organize before the relevant visit. The relevant friends and the relevant courtiers and the relevant members of the relevant social world who received the visits managed them in the conditions available to them, which were the conditions of the relevant social grace in the relevant immediate circumstances, and they described the experience afterward in the private channels the relevant conditions permitted them to use for the relevant description. The mechanism expressed something about the relevant character that the honest account requires to identify plainly. The mechanism expressed the entitlement of someone for whom the provision of the relevant preferences was the natural condition of the available world, rather than the specific product of the institutional management of that world's organization around the provision of the relevant requirements. The entitlement was not a consciously calculated deployment of the relevant institutional authority for the purpose of obtaining the relevant objects. It was the entitlement of someone whose decades of the relevant provision's consistency had naturalized the provision in the relevant person's experience of the available world. The naturalization was the entitlement. The entitlement was what the specific mechanism of the collecting most directly expressed in the conditions of the relevant social world's operation. She took things from people who did not wish to give them, through a social mechanism so polished and so practiced that the people from whom she took things found themselves thanking her for the privilege of the relevant occasion. The social elegance was genuine. The taking was also genuine. The coronation of George V on the 22nd of June 1911, which was May's formal assumption of the title and the role of Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, in the conditions of the relevant ceremony at Westminster Abbey, produced in the relevant public record the specific images of the relevant person in the relevant role that the subsequent decades of the relevant reign would develop into the Queen Mary of the photographs. She was 44 years old. She had spent the preceding 18 years inside the relevant institutional world's management of the relevant preparation for the relevant role, and the preparation had produced in her the specific capability of the relevant performance in the relevant conditions, whose exercise the coronation now formally initiated in the conditions of the relevant ceremony's public and institutional dimensions. The coronation was also the occasion of one of the more extensively cited available accounts of Queen Mary's conduct in the conditions of the relevant ceremony's management. She wore the relevant crown and the relevant robes, and she sat in the relevant position in the relevant ceremony, with the specific composure whose exercise across the relevant hours of the relevant ceremony's duration, the accounts of people present describe, with the consistency of independent observations, producing the same picture, which was the picture of someone whose management of the relevant institutional performance in the relevant available conditions was organized around the relevant available composure's sustained maintenance, with the consistency of someone for whom the relevant composure's maintenance was the natural and primary available mode of engagement with the relevant significant institutional occasion. She was genuinely suited to the role. The honest account requires acknowledging this, because the honest account of the relevant person requires holding both the relevant achievements and the relevant costs in the conditions of the relevant available evidence, and the relevant achievement of the relevant genuine suitability for the relevant role was real in the specific sense that the relevant performance of the relevant role across the subsequent 26 years of the relevant reign most directly documents. She was good at being queen. The relevant public engagement, and the relevant management of the relevant available state occasions, and the relevant ceremonial requirements, and the relevant available official engagements, were managed with the consistency of someone whose formation had organized itself around the relevant management's requirements, across the full span of the relevant preceding decades, and whose application of the relevant management capability to the relevant available circumstances produced the relevant available quality of the relevant performance. The management of the relevant public account across the relevant reign's duration was the management of someone whose organizational capability and institutional authority combined to produce in the conditions of the relevant available communications the specific version of the relevant public account that the relevant institution required the relevant public account to be. The version was produced with the efficiency that the relevant management brought to the relevant available activity. The relevant public account was the public account of the Queen Mary of the photographs, the composed and unreachable and impeccably performing the relevant available institutional requirements in the relevant available conditions. The production was maintained across the full available span of the relevant reign's duration. The German question arrived in August 1914 in the form of a declaration of war against a country to whose royal families the British monarchy was genealogically connected through the web of the preceding decades' dynastic marriages, in ways sufficiently well known to the relevant public to create the specific institutional communication challenge the relevant management was required to address. King George V was born Prince George of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His first cousin was Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor. Queen Mary was born a princess of the House of Teck, a German morganatic royal house whose name she carried and whose genealogical connections to the wider German royal world were the connections of her specific formation. The genealogical reality of the relevant connections was documented and known, and its management in the conditions of a war against Germany was the most significant communications challenge the relevant institutional management had been required to address since the Boer War's management of the relevant available public account. The House of Windsor was created by royal proclamation on the 17th of July 1917. The Saxe-Coburg and Gotha name was formally renounced. The relevant German titles held by the relevant members of the family were formally set aside. The performance of British identity in the conditions of the wartime circumstances was accomplished with the institutional efficiency the relevant communications challenge demanded, and it was received by the relevant public with the relief of people who required the relevant performance to express what it performed. The performance expressed exactly what it was designed to express. That was the nature of the relevant management. Kaiser Wilhelm II's reported observation that he looked forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha communicated with the specific precision of the relevant irony what the relevant cousin in Berlin understood the renunciation to have been. Queen Mary's engagement with the wartime circumstances was genuine and energetic, in the specific terms the relevant accounts of the period document. She organized charitable activities with the organizational capability the relevant formation had developed across the relevant decades of the relevant exercise. She coordinated the relevant household's contribution to the wartime requirements with the energy that the relevant available wartime work now gave an outlet for in the conditions of the relevant institutional purposes available expression. She wore the relevant practical clothes and drove the relevant practical vehicles and visited the relevant hospitals and factories and wartime institutions with the regularity that the relevant accounts document as the regularity of someone whose engagement with the available work was organized around genuine activity rather than its performance. The management of the relevant German dimension across the relevant war years produced in Queen Mary the specific condition of someone whose formation had always organized itself around the management of the relevant performance in the conditions of the relevant available circumstances. Applied to the specific circumstance of being required to perform British identity in the conditions of a war against the relevant German world from which her own formation had emerged. The performance was managed. It was managed with the efficiency that the relevant decades of the relevant management's practice had developed in the relevant person across the full span of the relevant adult life. She performed British identity in the wartime conditions, with the specific thoroughness of someone whose formation had always organized the management of the relevant performance as the primary available mode of engagement with the relevant available circumstances, applied now to the specific circumstance of the relevant British identity's wartime requirements. The German relatives were managed with the specific distance that the relevant management required in the conditions of the relevant wartime management of the relevant available relationships. The relevant correspondence with the relevant German connections was reduced in the conditions of the relevant available management of the relevant wartime circumstances. The relevant social world's management of the relevant German connections was organized around the relevant distance, whose maintenance the relevant institutional management of the relevant public account required in the conditions of the relevant wartime management's specific demands. The relevant relatives were managed with the specific combination of the relevant genuine family feeling and the relevant institutional requirements management of that feeling in the direction of the relevant available distances maintenance. The relationship between Queen Mary and the relevant antique and decorative arts world across the decades of the relevant reign produced a specific documented record of the relevant collecting's operation in the relevant conditions that the relevant available historical examination has assembled from the relevant available primary sources, with the specificity of people examining the relevant available evidence in the conditions of the relevant available access. The relevant dealers who serviced the relevant royal collection across the relevant decades described the relevant interactions with the relevant person in the terms available to people who were inside the relevant commercial relationship with the relevant institutional position across the relevant period. The relevant descriptions document the relevant mechanism's operation in the relevant commercial context with the specificity of people describing a sustained professional experience whose specific quality the relevant available description most directly captures. She visited Christie's and Sotheby's and the relevant other auction houses of the relevant period, at the relevant available sales, in the conditions of the relevant available institutional authorities' operation, in the relevant commercial context. The relevant dealers who attended the relevant sales described the specific quality of the relevant person's presence at the relevant available sales in terms that the relevant available accounts preserve, with the consistency of people recounting a shared professional experience. The presence was authoritative. The knowledge was genuine. The relevant acquisitions were made through the relevant available mechanisms of the relevant commercial context management in the conditions of the relevant institutional authority's most available expression in the relevant commercial circumstances. The royal collections were expanded across the relevant decades of the relevant reign by the relevant additions that the relevant collecting produced in the conditions of the relevant mechanism's consistent operation across the full span of the relevant adult life's available opportunities. The relevant additions are documented in the relevant curatorial records of the relevant royal collections and in the relevant available accounts of the relevant period's most significant available acquisitions in the conditions of the relevant institutional collections management of the relevant available records. The collection grew. The relevant available evidence of the relevant growth is in the relevant available records. The relevant available records are what the relevant honest account of the relevant collecting's production most directly draws on. The Romanov connection was the dimension of the wartime circumstances whose management produced consequences, whose historical significance the subsequent history established with the authority of the specific outcomes the specific choices produced. Empress Alexandra of Russia, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II, was Princess Alix of Hesse, the first cousin of King George V, through their shared grandmother Queen Victoria. The Empress was therefore a close relation of both Queen Mary's husband and, at a degree's remove, of Queen Mary herself, through the relevant genealogical connections of the relevant royal world's management of the relevant dynastic relationships. The personal connection between George V and his cousin Alexandra had been documented across the relevant private correspondence, with the warmth of a genuine personal relationship that the relevant decades of the relevant royal social world had organized around itself. The Romanovs fell to the revolution of February 1917. The Tsar abdicated in March 1917. The provisional government that succeeded the Tsar's abdication initially indicated a willingness to hold the relevant family in the relevant conditions of the relevant immediate post-abdication circumstances. But the political situation in Russia deteriorated across the relevant months of the relevant 1917 in ways that the relevant family's management of the relevant diplomatic communications was organized around monitoring. The question of whether Britain would offer sanctuary to the Romanov family was raised through the relevant diplomatic channels and examined by the relevant governmental machinery in the conditions of the relevant wartime political circumstances and the relevant domestic political climate. The relevant political assessment concluded that offering sanctuary would create specific political difficulties of a magnitude the relevant management was not organized around accommodating in the conditions of the relevant available political resources. The relevant governmental advice communicated the relevant conclusion to the relevant constitutional authority. The constitutional authority received the advice. The relevant offer of sanctuary was not extended. Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra and their 5 children, the Tsarevich Alexei and the Grand Duchesses Olga and Tatiana and Maria and Anastasia, were shot by Bolshevik forces in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg on the 17th of July 1918. Their bodies were buried in a forest outside the city. The Empress was the cousin of the man who had received the relevant governmental advice about the relevant offer of sanctuary and had acted upon it in the direction the relevant advice communicated. She had been to his wedding. Queen Mary's engagement with the relevant circumstances, in the conditions of her specific position in the relevant household in the relevant period, was the engagement of someone whose relationship with the relevant constitutional authority gave her the proximity to the relevant decision-making without the direct constitutional responsibility that the relevant decision required. What can be stated about the relevant engagement with the relevant honesty the relevant evidence supports is that the relevant management produced the relevant outcome, and that the relevant outcome was the outcome that was allowed to occur in the conditions of the relevant management's specific choices. The conflict between Queen Mary and her eldest son across the decades of his adult life was the most sustained and most publicly consequential of the parental conflicts the relevant domestic formation produced across the full span of the relevant adult children's lives, because the relevant conflict's specific outcome produced the most consequential institutional event of the 20th century British monarchy's management of the relevant constitutional circumstances. The event was the abdication of December 1936. David, as the family called him, was Prince of Wales from 1910, and was known to the relevant public across the decades of his father's reign as the most effective generator of the specific kind of royal public affection available to the relevant institution. He was genuinely good at the relevant public engagement in a way that the relevant private formation had not been organized around producing, but had produced as the natural expression of the personal warmth, whose other outlets the relevant institutional environment had consistently managed toward the margins of the available life. The warmth that the relevant domestic environment had not provided in adequate measure in the conditions of the relevant childhood had not been eliminated from his character by the relevant insufficiency. It had found its primary available expression in the public engagements, where the institutional permission for its expression was clearest, and the relevant crowd's reciprocal warmth provided the specific provision that the relevant formation's specific insufficiencies had not provided in the relevant private domestic conditions. The emotional patterns of his adult private life were the patterns that the relevant biographies document across the relevant years in the terms of the sustained attachments to women, and specifically to married women, whose common quality the honest account most directly identifies as the quality of providing the specific emotional attentiveness and management and direction that the relevant formation's specific insufficiencies had not provided in adequate measure in the conditions of the relevant childhood domestic world. The pattern was consistent enough across the relevant adult years to have the quality of a documented pattern rather than a series of independent personal choices. Without the formative connection, the consistency across the relevant examples suggests to the honest examiner who assembles the relevant evidence across the relevant sources. Each attachment provided a version of the specific provision the pattern was organized around seeking. Each produced the specific difficulty the relevant institutional management found, requiring management in the conditions of the relevant institutional position's requirements. The management of the relevant attachments across the relevant adult years was one of the more consistent available demands on the relevant institutional communications apparatus across the full span of the relevant Prince of Wales years. Wallace Warfield Simpson was an American woman from Baltimore, Maryland, whose two previous marriages had produced the divorce status that the relevant constitutional framework of the Church of England organized around, as the specific condition of the relevant incompatibility with the relevant constitutional requirements of the relevant royal position. She was, in the specific terms the relevant accounts of the people who knew her most directly establish, intelligent, with a social intelligence whose operation read the relevant people and the relevant situations with the accuracy of sustained practice in the relevant social contexts. She was direct in the way the relevant world found alternately refreshing and alarming. She had specific views and expressed them in terms organized around her own assessment rather than the terms the relevant institutional management of the relevant social world's requirements organized around. She was capable. She was funny in the specific sharp way of someone whose intelligence found in the relevant available material, the relevant available expression. What she provided David with was, in the honest terms the relevant adult emotional pattern's honest examination most directly supports, the most complete version of the specific provision the relevant pattern had been organized around seeking across the full span of the relevant adult years. She attended to him with a specificity and a directness and an organizational management of the relevant shared circumstances that the relevant previous versions of the relevant provision had not achieved in the same complete form. She was, in the specific terms of what the relevant adult emotional pattern required to find its most complete available expression, exactly what the relevant pattern required. The relationship between Queen Mary's management of the relevant domestic environment across the full span of the relevant children's childhood formation and the specific outcome of the relevant adult emotional pattern's most consequential available expression in the conditions of the relevant abdication crisis is a relationship the honest account requires to hold in the relevant view without asserting the specific causal connection between the relevant formation and the relevant adult outcome, with a confidence the available evidence in the specific case does not directly support. What the available evidence does support is the documentation of the relevant domestic environment, and the documentation of the relevant adult emotional pattern, and the documentation of the relevant outcome. And the relationship between those three documented things is a relationship the honest examiner cannot avoid in the conditions of the relevant examination's honest engagement with the relevant evidence. King George V died on the 20th of January 1936. The relevant medical documentation of the relevant final hours, specifically the diary entry of Lord Dawson of Penn, the royal physician responsible for the relevant medical management of the relevant final circumstances, was not accessible to public examination until 1986, when the relevant archival access made it available. The diary entry describes, in the terms of a private document, written without awareness of subsequent examination, the administration of injections of morphine and cocaine to the king in the specific conditions of the relevant final hours, and the description of the rationale for the administration includes the observation that the relevant death should occur in the conditions that would allow its announcement to appear in the morning newspapers rather than the evening ones. The entry is in the historical record. The relevant people in the relevant household in the relevant final hours were aware of what was happening. Queen Mary was in the relevant household. David became Edward VIII on the 20th of January 1936. He remained Edward DAI for 326 days. He signed the abdication statement on the 10th of December 1936 and broadcast to the nation the following morning. He left England. He never returned to live in it. Queen Mary's role in the management of the abdication crisis was the role of the relevant former queen, whose specific personal authority and institutional standing gave her the maximum available informal influence over the direction of the relevant management, without the direct constitutional responsibility that would have made the relevant formal engagement in the relevant constitutional process inappropriate. She was his mother. She was the woman who had organized the relevant institutional requirements of the relevant position across the preceding 4 decades, with the consistency of someone for whom the relevant primary organizational principles application to the relevant available circumstances was the natural and primary available mode of engagement with the significant decisions of the relevant life. She opposed the marriage. She expressed the opposition through the relevant channels of the relevant parental authority's management of the relevant relationship in the vocabulary of duty and responsibility and constitutional incompatibility. She did not engage with the personal dimensions of what David was asking for, in the terms that the honest engagement with those personal dimensions would have required, which were the terms of acknowledging what the relevant formation had contributed to producing in the relevant person across the relevant decades of the relevant relationship, and what the relevant management's consistent direction toward the relevant institutional conclusion required the relevant person to surrender in the conditions of the relevant surrender's specific human cost. The relationship between Queen Mary and the question of her eldest son's suitability for the relevant constitutional position across the full span of the relevant preceding decades, before the relevant crisis's acute available phase, deserves the examination that the relevant available evidence most directly supports in the terms of the relevant honest accounts engagement with the relevant available primary sources. Queen Mary had observed David across the full span of the relevant childhood years, and the relevant young adult years, and the relevant Prince of Wales years, in the conditions of the relevant available parental observation, and what the relevant available observation had produced in the relevant person was the relevant available assessment of the relevant son's specific combination of the relevant available qualities and the relevant available difficulties in the context of the relevant constitutional position's specific requirements. The relevant available assessment was not consistently favorable. The relevant available accounts of Queen Mary's communications about David across the relevant available years to the relevant available people in the relevant available private channels document the specific quality of the relevant available concern about the relevant available difficulties in the conditions of the relevant constitutional position's most acute available requirements. The relevant concern was organized around the specific combination of the relevant available qualities, whose presence in the relevant person, the relevant available observation, had established as the relevant available positive dimensions of the relevant assessment, and the relevant available difficulties, whose presence in the relevant person, the relevant available observation, had established as the relevant available concerns in the context of the relevant constitutional position's specific requirements. The relevant available qualities included the relevant personal warmth and the relevant public engagement capability, and the specific quality of the relevant popular affection, whose generation in the relevant available public occasions, the relevant available observation had documented, with the consistency of someone observing the relevant phenomenon across the relevant available years of the relevant Prince of Wales's management of the relevant available public occasions. The relevant available difficulties included the relevant emotional instability and the relevant available pattern of the relevant adult attachments and the specific combination of the relevant available personal characteristics, whose management in the conditions of the relevant constitutional position's most acute available requirements, the relevant observation had documented as the relevant available concern. The specific 11 months between Edward VI's accession in January 1936 and the abdication in December 1936 were the 11 months whose management produced the most extensively documented available account of the relevant constitutional crisis in the 20th century British monarchy's management of the relevant constitutional circumstances. The management was the management of multiple simultaneous dimensions of the relevant crisis, which were the constitutional dimension and the political dimension and the personal dimension and the communications dimension, and the management of each of the relevant dimensions required the relevant management's organization around the relevant available resources and the relevant available mechanisms for the production of the relevant available outcomes. The constitutional dimension was the dimension most directly managed by the relevant constitutional framework's available mechanisms, which were the mechanisms of the relevant Prime Minister's advice, and the relevant Commonwealth government's communications, and the relevant parliamentary position's management in the conditions of the relevant crisis's constitutional implications. Stanley Baldwin, who was Prime Minister in the relevant period, managed the relevant political dimension of the relevant crisis with the sustained professionalism of someone whose political experience and political capability gave him the specific available resources for the management of the relevant political circumstances in the relevant available political conditions. The relevant Prime Minister's management of the relevant political dimension produced the relevant available political position that the relevant available political conditions organized around. Queen Mary's role in the relevant crisis's management was the role of the relevant informal authority whose specific combination of the relevant institutional standing and the relevant personal relationship with the relevant constitutional protagonist gave her the maximum available influence over the relevant crisis's management without the direct formal constitutional responsibility that would have made the relevant formal participation in the relevant formal constitutional processes inappropriate in the conditions of the relevant crisis's formal management. The specific communications between Queen Mary and Edward VI across the relevant 11 months of the relevant crisis's duration were conducted through the relevant available channels of the relevant correspondence and the relevant available personal meetings in the conditions of the relevant crisis's management. The letters that the relevant archives preserve from the relevant period document the specific quality of the relevant communications in the terms that the relevant primary sources most directly provide. The quality was the quality of a mother communicating to a son the relevant institutional assessment in the relevant institutional vocabulary, in the conditions of the relevant formation's operation, in the relevant significant personal relationship's most acute available challenge. She could not see what he was asking for, in the terms that the honest seeing of what he was asking for would have required, which were the terms of the relevant adult emotional patterns formation, in the conditions of the relevant childhood domestic environment, and the specific provision of the relevant attachment's most complete available version, in the conditions of the relevant relationship with the relevant person, the relevant institution found incompatible with the relevant institutional requirements. She saw the institutional incompatibility. She saw the constitutional impossibility. She communicated the relevant institutional assessment in the relevant institutional vocabulary. She did not see the formation's contribution to the relevant situation in the terms that the honest seeing would have required. Queen Mary never met Wallis Simpson. The never was the product of a deliberate decision maintained across the 16 remaining years of Queen Mary's life, with the specific consistency of someone whose primary organizational principle resolved the conflicts between the personal and the institutional, in the institutional's direction, across the full available span of the relevant decision's duration. David married Wallis in France on the 3rd of June 1937. He spent the rest of his life in the conditions the relevant estrangement and the relevant exile produced. Queen Mary maintained the relevant never across the relevant 16 subsequent years of the relevant maintenance's duration. She wrote to David, "The letters exist. Their specific quality is the quality of someone communicating in the relevant institutional vocabulary, in the conditions of the relevant formation's management of the relevant significant personal relationship's most acute available challenge." She loved David. The relevant private correspondence documents the genuine love across the relevant years of the relevant relationship. The management of the relevant situation, in the conditions of the relevant love's simultaneous presence with the relevant institutional obligation's priority, produced the relevant estrangement, which was maintained across 16 years. Both the love and the estrangement were real. They were both expressions of the same formation. The formation's primary organizational principle resolved the conflict between them in the institutional's direction, as it had always resolved the relevant conflicts in the relevant conditions across the full span of the relevant adult life. If you are hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Badminton House in Gloucestershire, the seat of Henry Somerset, the 10th Duke of Beaufort, and his wife Mary, became Queen Mary's wartime residence from September 1939 until May 1945, in the conditions of the relevant institutional management of the wartime risk to the relevant person's safety, in the relevant urban conditions of the relevant blitz's management of the relevant available threat assessment. The Duke and Duchess of Beaufort received their royal guest with the genuine institutional loyalty and the private complexity whose specific quality the relevant biographies document, with the consistency of people who had observed the relevant reception from inside the relevant world, and who retained the relevant observations with sufficient specificity for the relevant biographers who examined the relevant period. Queen Mary arrived at Badminton in September 1939 with 55 members of her household staff. The number appears in the relevant accounts of the relevant arrival, with the consistency of a fact that the people who document it find remarkable in the specific conditions of a country at war, organizing the relevant available national resources around the relevant wartime requirements. 55 members of staff represented the institutional minimum complement for the appropriate maintenance of the relevant person in the conditions of the relevant available residence, assessed through the relevant criteria, the relevant institutional management applied to the relevant logistical requirements of the relevant temporary wartime arrangement. The Duke and Duchess found themselves in the specific position of the relevant hosts in the conditions of a 5-year wartime residence, whose specific quality the relevant prior hospitality of the relevant country house had not prepared them for in the specific conditions of its actual experience. Queen Mary organized Badminton. The organizing was the organizing of someone whose formation had always organized itself around the management of the available environment in the direction of the relevant requirements, applied to the Duke of Beaufort's Gloucestershire estate, with the full available force of the organizational energy and the institutional authority and the personal drive that the relevant decades had developed in the relevant person in the conditions of the relevant exercise of the relevant management capabilities across the full span of the relevant adult life. The ivy was the first and most documented of the identified available improvements. Badminton's walls and the relevant outbuildings were covered in the quantities of ivy that the relevant centuries of the relevant estate's management had allowed to accumulate on the relevant surfaces. Queen Mary identified the relevant vegetation as a waste of available wartime agricultural labor and a potential fire hazard in the conditions of the relevant wartime emergency, whose management the relevant available resources were required to address in the relevant available directions. She organized salvage parties to address the relevant identification's specific implications. The salvage parties were the organized deployment of the available estate workers, under the personal supervision of the relevant organizing authority, across the relevant clearing operations the relevant identification required. The clearing was thorough. The salvage operations at Badminton produced one of the more extensively documented anecdotal records of the relevant wartime residence's specific quality. Queen Mary organized the relevant estate workers into the relevant parties and supervised the relevant clearing operations with the personal engagement of someone whose organizational capabilities had found in the relevant clearing activity the specific available productive outlet that the relevant wartime circumstances and the relevant available location had organized around the relevant available work. She wore the relevant practical outdoor clothing, and she drove the relevant available motor car across the relevant available land of the relevant estate, and she supervised the relevant available workers in the relevant available directions, with the consistency of someone whose engagement with the relevant available activity was organized around genuine activity rather than its performance. The Duke of Beaufort's accounts of the relevant period, preserved in the relevant biographical material that has examined the relevant figure's life and times, describe a man managing the relevant wartime hosting arrangement with the relevant patience and the relevant loyalty in conditions where the relevant available patience and the relevant available loyalty were organized around the relevant wartime duties' specific requirements, rather than around the relevant available enthusiasm for the relevant wartime guests' management of the relevant available environment. He was loyal. He was patient. He also understood, in the specific terms of someone living inside the relevant 5-year wartime hosting arrangement, what the relevant management of the relevant available environment had produced in the conditions of the relevant 5 years' duration. The house parties that Queen Mary organized at Badminton across the relevant wartime years were the house parties of someone whose formation had always organized the relevant social occasions around the relevant management of the relevant available social requirements in the relevant institutional register of the relevant position's most practiced available mode. She organized the relevant social occasions at Badminton with the efficiency of someone for whom the relevant social occasions management was the primary available mode of the relevant social engagement. The relevant people who attended the relevant social occasions at Badminton during the relevant wartime years described them with the consistency of people who found in the relevant occasions the specific quality of the relevant managed social engagement, whose organization around the relevant requirements of the relevant institutional register was the most consistently available characteristic of the relevant occasions management. The ivy came down from Badminton's walls over the course of the relevant operations with the thoroughness that the relevant personal supervision produced in the conditions of someone whose organizational energy had found in the relevant clearing activity the specific productive outlet that the relevant wartime residence's available circumstances had organized around the relevant available location. The relevant architectural features of the relevant house emerged from the relevant vegetation's centuries of coverage. The relevant grounds were managed in the relevant available directions with the consistency of the relevant organizational energy's sustained application across the full available duration of the relevant wartime residence. She also organized wood clearing operations across the relevant available land of the relevant estate. She organized salvage operations for various categories of the relevant available materials. She drove around the relevant estate in the relevant available motor car and supervised the relevant available work and organized the relevant available workers in the relevant available directions with the consistency of someone whose engagement with the available work was organized around the genuine activity of the relevant management rather than the performed engagement with the relevant available institutional duty. The Duke of Beaufort managed the relevant 5 years with the patience of someone whose specific institutional loyalty to the relevant institution and the relevant person were genuine, and whose private experience of the relevant 5 years combined the relevant genuine loyalty with the relevant private complexity that the relevant accounts describe, with the candor of the relevant biographical distance from the relevant events. He was loyal. The relevant gardens sustained the relevant attentions of the relevant wartime residences management across the relevant 5 years, with the patience of gardens whose recovery from sustained attentive management requires the subsequent passage of the relevant years. The specific quality of the relevant wartime years at Badminton deserves the examination that the available accounts of the relevant period most directly support in the terms of the relevant documented evidence the relevant examination makes available. The 5 years between September 1939 and May 1945 were the 5 years in which the relevant person's organizational capabilities and institutional authority found in the relevant available environment of the relevant country estate, the specific available outlet for the relevant management drive, that the relevant wartime circumstances and the relevant available location had organized around in the conditions of the relevant 5-year duration. Queen Mary drove through the surrounding Gloucestershire countryside in the relevant available motor car and visited the relevant available local institutions with the frequency that the relevant available transport and the relevant available schedule produced in the conditions of someone whose engagement with the relevant available activities in the relevant available local area was organized around genuine activity rather than the performed engagement that the relevant available institutional position might have accommodated as an adequate substitute for the genuine kind. She visited the relevant local farms and the relevant local institutions and the relevant local people in the conditions of the relevant wartime Gloucestershire that the relevant available local world organized around itself across the relevant 5 years of the relevant wartime circumstances. The relevant people of the relevant local area encountered the relevant Queen Mother in the relevant available local contexts across the relevant 5 years of the relevant wartime residence, with the specific combination of the genuine royal contact and the relevant available institutional surprise that the relevant wartime circumstances had organized around the relevant available local encounters. The relevant local accounts describe the relevant person in the relevant available local contexts, with the consistency of people who found in the relevant encounters something different from the relevant expected quality of the relevant royal visit's performance, which was the genuine engagement of someone whose interest in the relevant available activities was organized around genuine interest rather than the relevant available performance of genuine interest in the relevant available conditions. The management of the relevant wartime correspondence and the relevant wartime communications from Badminton was the management of someone whose institutional position and institutional authority gave her the specific available access to the relevant available communications infrastructure that the relevant wartime circumstances had organized around the relevant available institutional position's specific requirements. She corresponded with the relevant available people across the relevant wartime years in the conditions of the relevant available correspondence's management of the relevant available communications in the relevant available directions. The relevant correspondence was substantial, and it was managed with the consistency of someone whose engagement with the relevant available communications was organized around the genuine management of the relevant available relationships and the relevant available institutional requirements across the full span of the relevant 5-year duration. Queen Mary returned to London in May 1945. The relevant war in Europe had concluded. The relevant country house was returned to its owners in the condition the relevant 5 years management had produced in the relevant gardens and the relevant land and the relevant architectural surfaces of the relevant estate. The relevant owners manage the relevant return with the relevant loyalty and the relevant relief that the relevant accounts describe, with the relevant consistency of people who had hosted an extraordinary wartime guest for an extraordinary wartime duration. The losses of the final years accumulated with the weight of losses that had been accumulating across the full span of the relevant preceding decades, in the conditions of the relevant formation's management of the relevant significant personal experiences of the relevant life. George, the Duke of Kent, died on the 25th of August 1942 when the aircraft in which he was traveling as part of the wartime operational duties of the relevant Air Force service crashed in Scotland in the conditions of the relevant operational circumstances. He was 39 years old. He was the fifth child and the most personally charming of the relevant children, by the consistent assessment of the people who had encountered him in the relevant social world across the relevant adult years. His death in the wartime conditions produced in Queen Mary the specific additional dimension of the relevant accumulated losses, whose management in the relevant primary organizational principles most available mode was the primary available response. Albert, who was King George VI, died on the 6th of February 1952 at Sandringham. He was 56 years old. He had been suffering from lung cancer, which had required the removal of his left lung in September 1951, and the subsequent months had produced the deterioration of the relevant circulatory system, whose thrombotic conclusion the February death documented. He had managed the relevant constitutional position with the genuine dignity and the genuine seriousness that the relevant formation and the relevant marriage to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had combined to produce in the conditions of the relevant available competence applied to the relevant available circumstances across the full span of the relevant reign. The marriage had been, by the consistent assessment of the people who observed it from inside the relevant world across the relevant decades, the most sustaining available relationship of the relevant adult life, organized around the specific provision of the genuine human warmth and the genuine personal engagement that the relevant childhood formation had not provided in adequate measure. The provision had made the relevant sustained management of the relevant institutional requirements possible in the conditions of the relevant available resources. Queen Mary outlived Albert. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived John in January 1919. She had outlived George, the Duke of Kent, in 1942. She had lived with the institutional estrangement from David across the 16 years following the abdication. She had now outlived Albert. The accumulation was the accumulation of someone who had managed the significant personal experiences of the relevant life across the full span of the relevant preceding decades, in the conditions of the relevant formation's primary available mode, and whose management of the relevant final losses was the management of the same mode applied to the relevant available circumstances of the relevant advanced years. Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II on the 6th of February 1952. She was 25 years old. She was Queen Mary's granddaughter. The relationship between them had been warmer than the relevant parent-child relationships that the preceding sections of this account have examined, which is the characterization the relevant accounts of the relationship support, with the consistency of independent observations producing the same available picture. The grandparental relationship provided a degree of permission for the genuine feelings expression that the relevant parental relationships had not produced in the same available measure in the conditions of the relevant formation's primary organizational principles operation in the relevant direct relationships with the relevant children. The warmth was genuine. It retained the specific quality of the relevant formation's management in the conditions of the relevant engagements available modes. It was warmer than the relevant parental engagements had been. It was not unconstrained. Queen Mary expressed to the relevant people around her in the final months of her life the determination to remain alive long enough to witness the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, which was scheduled for the 2nd of June 1953. She had survived the relevant preceding decades of the relevant accumulated losses and the relevant accumulated management of the relevant available circumstances with the sustained application of the relevant primary organizational principles most available mode. She wanted to see the coronation of the queen she had watched grow up, and in whom she recognized the continuation of the relevant institutional formation's most available expression in the conditions of the relevant next generation's assumption of the relevant position. She died on the 24th of March, 1953. She was 85 years old. She died at Marlborough House in London, 10 weeks before the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The will she had left included the instruction that her death should not be permitted to interrupt the preparations for the coronation, or to alter the ceremonial schedule in the conditions of a conventional mourning period's organizational requirements. Because the relevant occasion's significance in the conditions of the relevant institutional requirements was the significance that the relevant person's management of the relevant priorities had always placed above the personal dimensions of the relevant circumstances across the full span of the relevant adult life. In the conditions of her own death, she organized the relevant institutional requirements above the personal dimensions of the relevant ceremonial consequences. The instruction was the instruction of Queen Mary. It was the final expression of the primary organizational principle the relevant formation had produced as the most available mode of engagement with the relevant significant circumstances of the relevant life. The honest assessment of what Queen Mary actually was, assembled from the specific evidence this account has examined across its preceding sections, is more complicated than the relevant official account has consistently provided. The complication is the complication of someone whose specific combination of qualities produced both the achievements the official account celebrates and the costs the official account manages into the background of that celebration, in the conditions of a life whose achievement and whose cost were both products of the same formation, applied to the same circumstances, with the same consistent primary organizational principle across the full span of the relevant decades. She was selfish in the specific terms the documented evidence most directly supports. The selfishness was not the selfishness of deliberate personal calculation organized around the conscious preference for the relevant personal benefit at the explicit expense of the available other's well-being. It was the selfishness of institutional orientation, whose primary organizational principle was the relevant institution's requirements at the specific expense of the personal dimensions of the relevant relationships with the people whose personal claims on the relevant person were the most direct and the most legitimate. The children were the most direct expression of the relevant cost. They required from her the specific human warmth that the relevant formation had produced no adequate mechanism for providing in the relevant direct relationships, and the cost of the relevant insufficiency accumulated across the decades of the relevant adult lives in the specific quality of the difficulties the relevant formation had contributed to producing. Edward, who abdicated the crown of England, partly because the relevant formation's specific insufficiencies had contributed to producing in him the adult emotional pattern, whose most complete expression the relevant institutional world could not accommodate. Albert, whose stammer and anxiety the relevant domestic environment's conditions had contributed to producing in the specific developmental circumstances the relevant developmental understanding most directly supports. The children who address their parents as sir and ma'am in the conventions of a household whose domestic organization was arranged around the management of the relevant performance rather than the provision of the relevant genuine. Prince John, whose management as the family member whose condition was inconsistent with the relevant public account, produced the specific conditions of the relevant institutional invisibility across the relevant final years of the relevant life. She was spoiled in the specific terms the documented evidence most directly supports. The entitlement expressed in the collecting mechanism's consistent operation across the full span of the relevant adult life was not the entitlement of someone who had always been given things. She had spent her adolescence in relative financial exile in Florence. The entitlement was the product of the specific decades of the relevant institutional environment's organization around the provision of what the relevant person required in the conditions of the relevant position's operation. And those decades had produced in the relevant person the specific character of someone for whom the provision was the natural condition of the available world, rather than the specific product of the institutional management of the available world's organization around the provision of the relevant requirements. The naturalization was the entitlement. The deploying of the relevant institutional authority through the specific social mechanism of the relevant admiration to produce the relevant transfers across the full span of the relevant collecting's operation was the entitlement's most consistently documented available expression in the conditions of the relevant social world. She took things. She took them with genuine knowledge and with the specific social grace of the relevant admiration's vocabulary. But the taking was taking, and the people she took things from knew it, and described it in private, with the candor that private channels permitted. She was feared in the specific terms the documented evidence most directly supports. The fear was real, and it was produced by something real, which was the specific combination of the relevant institutional authority, and the relevant personal demands, and the relevant emotional management of the relevant relationships in the conditions of the relevant formation's consistent operation across the full span of the relevant decades. The fear was produced in the relevant household staff, and in the relevant courtiers, and in the relevant antique dealers, and in the relevant members of the relevant social world, who received the relevant visits, and in the relevant children. And it was produced by the specific combination, whose honest examination this account has conducted, in the conditions of the relevant evidence the relevant examination makes available. The official account of Queen Mary is the account the relevant institutional management was organized across the full span of the relevant lifetime and the subsequent decades of the relevant legacy's management to produce. It celebrates the specific institutional achievements of the relevant public life in the register of institutional admiration the relevant achievements genuinely warrant. The achievements were real. The devoted management of the relevant institutional requirements across the relevant decades produced the specific institutional stability, the relevant institution's survival of the relevant historical period most directly required, and the relevant institution survived the 2 world wars and the abdication and the full convulsive sequence of the 20th century's most significant challenges to the relevant institution's management of its specific position in the available world. The honest account requires the simultaneous acknowledgement of what the achievement cost in the conditions of the relevant lives the achievement's production was organized at the expense of. Not to cancel the achievement. The achievement was real, and its significance was genuine. To place the achievement alongside the cost in the conditions of an honest account that holds both, rather than using either to exclude the other from the available record. The children and their specific adult difficulties. The domestic environment whose primary organizational principle produced the relevant specific formation the relevant accounts document across the relevant decades. The objects taken through the specific mechanism of the relevant social world's most practiced deployment of the relevant available institutional authority. The people who experienced in the relevant presence the specific fear that the relevant combination of the relevant authority and the relevant demands and the relevant emotional management produced. The relevant institutional management of the relevant public account across the relevant subsequent decades following Queen Mary's death in March 1953 produced the specific version of the relevant public legacy that the relevant official account most directly represents. The relevant authorized biography by James Pope Hennessy, whose research involved the relevant access to the relevant archives and the relevant interviews with the relevant people who had been inside the relevant world, with the relevant subject across the relevant adult life, was published in 1959 and produced the most complete available single account of the relevant life in the conditions of the relevant access that the relevant authorized biography's production made available. The relevant account is the most extensive available single documentary examination of the relevant life, and the relevant evidence it assembled across the relevant research is the evidence that the honest examination of the relevant life most directly requires to engage with in the conditions of the relevant examination's available access to the relevant primary sources. The relevant subsequent biographies and the relevant subsequent historical examinations have added to the relevant available documentary record across the relevant decades since the relevant authorized biography's publication. The relevant additions have built the relevant available understanding of the relevant figure across the relevant available directions that the relevant subsequent historical examination has organized around in the conditions of the relevant available evidence's specific content. The building has produced the more complicated and more complicated picture of the relevant figure that the relevant honest examination of the relevant evidence most directly supports. The picture is more complicated than the relevant official account. It is more complicated than the relevant critical account that the relevant figure's specific combination of the relevant selfish, the relevant spoiled, and the relevant feared most directly suggests to the relevant examiner, who organizes the relevant examination around the relevant available critical conclusions without the relevant simultaneous acknowledgement of the relevant achievements that the relevant official account most directly celebrates. The honest account holds both. It holds the relevant achievements in the conditions of the relevant available evidence that supports them. It holds the relevant costs in the conditions of the relevant available evidence that documents them. It holds the relevant formation in the conditions of the relevant available evidence that established its specific character and its specific operation across the full span of the relevant adult life. It holds all of these simultaneously in the conditions of the relevant honest examination's engagement with the relevant evidence. Queen Mary was 85 years old when she died. She had been born in 1867 in the conditions of the relevant morganatic family's specific social position, and she had died in 1953 in the conditions of the relevant matriarchal authority's most concentrated available expression in the relevant institutional world. The full span of the relevant adult life between those two dates was the life whose honest examination this account has conducted in the terms the relevant available evidence most directly supports. The relevant achievements and the relevant costs and the relevant formation and the relevant primary organizational principles' consistent operation across the full span of the relevant adult life are all in the permanent record. The permanent record is what the honest account assembles the relevant evidence from. The evidence is what the evidence is. The record is what the record is. She was selfish and spoiled and secretly feared, and she was also one of the most disciplined and most significant figures in the management of the 20th century British monarchy's institutional survival. The first three things and the last thing were all produced by the same formation. The same formation produced them all. She was feared. She was selfish. She was spoiled. She was also one of the most consequential individual figures in the management of the 20th century British monarchy's institutional survival. All of those things are simultaneously true. They were produced by the same formation. They were expressed by the same person across the full span of the same adult life. They are all in the permanent record of what the available documented evidence most directly supports. The portraits remain in the relevant collections. The silver hair and the upright posture and the composed expression are in the photographs, and will remain in them. The children she formed lived their adult lives in the specific conditions of what the relevant formation had given them. The objects she acquired are in the relevant royal collections. The relevant country house eventually recovered something of its pre-arrival condition. The relevant estranged son lived the remainder of his life in the conditions the relevant estrangement and the relevant exile had produced. The relevant institution continued. The relevant management of the relevant public accounts continues. The record is what the record is. She was exactly what the record shows. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next. The honest account of Queen Mary's formation requires returning to the Florence years one final time, because the Florence years were the years that produced the most enduring available dimension of the relevant honest account subject, which was not the relevant collecting's eye, or the relevant cultural knowledge, or the relevant specific capability for the assessment of the relevant decorative objects, but something more fundamental than any of those specific available dimensions of the relevant Florence year's formative production. The Florence years produced in May of Tech, the specific understanding that the management of the relevant performance in the relevant available circumstances was the primary available mechanism for the relevant maintenance of the relevant available position, and that the relevant management's quality was what the relevant world most directly organized its evaluation of the relevant person around. The understanding was the foundation of the relevant formation's primary organizational principle, and the primary organizational principle was what the relevant adult life's management of the relevant available circumstances was organized around across the full span of the relevant 6 decades of the relevant adult life's most significant available decisions and their specific outcomes. The understanding was built in the specific conditions of a 16-year-old observing the relevant social world in Florence, from the specific position of someone whose family was there, because the relevant management of the relevant performance, in the relevant available circumstances, had not been adequate to prevent the relevant financial consequences whose management had required the relevant exile. The understanding of what the relevant failure of the relevant management's adequate maintenance produced in the relevant available consequences was the understanding the Florence years produced in the relevant person in the conditions of the relevant specific observation of the relevant available consequences. The understanding was the understanding that the relevant management's adequate maintenance was not optional. It was the primary available requirement. It was what everything else depended on. The primary organizational principle that the relevant formation's most fundamental available understanding produced in the relevant person across the full span of the relevant adult life was the principle that the management of the relevant performance was the primary available requirement, and that the relevant personal dimensions of the relevant available life were the dimensions that the relevant management's requirements organized around, rather than the dimensions that the relevant management's requirements were organized in service of. The relevant personal dimensions were real. The relevant genuine feeling was real. The relevant love for the relevant children was real. The relevant love for David was real. The relevant genuine knowledge of the relevant decorative objects was real. The relevant genuine warmth for the relevant grandchildren was real. All of these relevant genuine dimensions were real. They were organized around the relevant management's primary available requirement in the conditions of the relevant formation's most fundamental available understanding of what the relevant available world most directly required for the relevant available maintenance of the relevant available position. The relevant management produced the relevant official account. The relevant genuine dimensions produced the relevant honest account. Both accounts are in the permanent record. The permanent record is where the honest examination of the relevant evidence most directly conducts its engagement with the relevant available subject. The historical record on which the honest account of Queen Mary most directly depends is a record assembled across the century since the relevant events from the relevant primary sources and the relevant secondary accounts and the relevant biographical examinations that the relevant historians and the relevant biographers have conducted in the conditions of the relevant available access to the relevant available material. The most significant single contribution to the relevant available record is the authorized biography by James Pope Hennessy, commissioned by Queen Mary herself and completed in the years following her death, which draws on the relevant correspondence and the relevant interviews with the relevant people who were inside the relevant world, with the relevant subject across the relevant adult life. The relevant biography's specific contribution to the relevant available understanding of the relevant person is the contribution of someone who had access to the relevant material in the relevant conditions and who used that access to produce the most complete available single account of the relevant life. The relevant subsequent additions to the relevant available record across the relevant subsequent decades have supplemented and in certain respects qualified the relevant authorized account with the contributions of the relevant later biographical examinations, which drew on the relevant subsequent archival openings and the relevant subsequent availability of the relevant primary sources that the relevant archival management of the relevant period had organized around in the conditions of the relevant subsequent decades passage. The record assembled from all of the relevant available sources is the record the honest examination of the relevant subject most directly requires to engage with, and the engagement is the engagement this account has attempted to conduct in the conditions of the relevant evidence's honest examination. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.